David?
Yep. Yeah, fine.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last Desert Island Discs from Portsmouth Cathedral's Lent programme. It's a real delight to welcome Bishop David Stancliffe, who so many of you will remember for his time as Provost of Portsmouth. And perhaps at some point this evening, David will remind us and tell some of us who might not know why deans used to be called provosts, but that perhaps come a little bit later. David joins us from way up north, and so the internet connection is a little bit dicey. We'll be able to hear everything he says, but the camera image may not be perfect, so please bear with us. We've got obviously a wonderful selection of music from David, and we'll be hearing some of his life stories, and also learning what one of his favorite desserts is. So David, it's wonderful to welcome you to this evening. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your upbringing? I think we're having a little bit of trouble hearing what David is saying, I'm afraid. Just bear with us, everybody, while we see if we can sort something out. We'll just be with you in a minute. So we think we've got the microphones working again now. So I've introduced David, and we'd love to hear a little bit about your upbringing, David.
Well, my first upbringing that is relevant for this is when we were living in Dean's Yard, and my parish church was St Mark's or the Abbey, and I listened to music. But before that, my godmother had taken me to a performance of the Mass when I was 9 in the Royal Albert. It was when um, the Bach choir under Dr. James, and he used to beat the opening chorus in 9 quaver bum 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 bum. And nowadays we wonder whether to do it in 2 in the bar. So that's the extent of how far we've moved in the last 70 years.
And so did you attend St Margaret's, or did you attend Westminster Abbey, or did you get a pick of both?
Well, got a bit of both, and very soon I was beginning to sing in as a dep in various church choirs in London, or be sent off to the East by organ builder friend Noel Mander to play the organ for somebody who's August ankle or something.
Mm.
So I got a very varied London-based church beat.
And this was because your father was a canon of Westminster, is that right?
He was a canon of Westminster by then and rector of St Margaret's, Westminster, and speaker to the Commons chaplain.
Yes.
And so I got a chance to sing anywhere I wanted, really, in London, honestly. And because the school, or when the school had to go, had the Abbey, and I was there most days in the week, I was often somewhere else, like Westminster Cathedral, for example. And the exotic nature of more Catholic style worship in the church at that stage was gripping. Betjeman was writing about beautiful Victorian churches, and there they all were in the middle of London, St Augustine's, Kilburn, or All Saints Margaret. And I used to have a wonderful time on Sunday going and tasting the music, probably tasting the sermons.
Wonderful. And so you will have heard two very different musical traditions then in Westminster Abbey and Westminster Cathedral. How would you characterize that, both in organ and choir?
Well, the Abbey was marvelous because it had very good sub-organists for the most part. Dr. Ozzie Peasgood was there at the first, and he used to play the organ Matthew Passion performances from the Bar Choir Albert Hall with a full organ going for dramatic bits on Barham and that kind of, and also in Westminster Cathedral, it was a noticeably different sound. And I think I began to use early experiences that, singing wasn't just singing. It might be singing of one kind or singing of another. And quite soon I was really, I think, listening to people like Donald Byrd, Abbey Choir, or Alfred Deller on gramophone record, that the kind of voice you might need to sing an opera was rather different from what you might need to sing a Purcell verse anthem, let alone a Josse mass. So that was an important part of early experience, and learning that the different styles, not only of singing, but of organing. And one of the great things about London was that there were all the organs around. The new organ was in the Royal Festival, designed by Ralph Downes from the Brompton Oratory, but built by an English organ builder. It was very continental in style. And one of the wonderful is at 5 to 6 of the organ recitals that they had there on the evening, 5:55, the blind German organist Helmut Walker, who came and played. And as an old, crusty old bachelor colonel, retired master, said, absolutely spiffing, no smudge at all. And that was the kind of feeling of the clarity of the new music making that was just over, really, because although I was going to the Bach cantatas performed by Nits in St Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield, as much as I possibly could. There was still, it was still expectation that big performances of things like the Matthew Pack would be with huge choirs, 200 or 300 people in a choir, and in playing with them, and the hundreds of players and playing on modern instruments of vibrato and lots of strong sound. But I managed to sort of see through all that to the real music, and I suppose with Bach when I was 9.
Wonderful. Well, shall we hear that one of those, that one of your first choice, which is indeed Helmut Wacker playing some Bach? I can't remember which. Tell us a little bit about this recording very briefly. What instrument is he playing on?
This recording was done by the German firm Archive, producing the hit recordings, historic principles, and yellow card covers with an insert in them on a blue card, which gave all the historical details of the instruments, forming additions, and introduced me to the idea that music and performance practice might be important. And the recordings were made on Schnittger organ by the North German builder Alp Schnittger.
Let's hear the Bach. we got you. Are you able to turn the camera off remotely, Joe? Yep, yep, yep. Brilliant. So that's interesting for to people who might need a little bit more explanation. It's fascinating to hear the brittleness and the brightness of that organ sound, isn't it? I suppose a very quick summary would be to say that a lot of English cathedral organs have a much smoother tone and are almost exclusively geared for accompanying, whereas a lot of continental organs are designed for organ repertoire that is for solo pieces. Would that be a fair summary, David?
I think that will be a fair summary, and I was lucky because I was met one or two people like Felix Abraham, who was then the music critic of the Sunday Times, who hearing me try to stumble through some Couperin organ masses UMP in Russell Square as a schoolboy, said to me, nobody's ever taught you how to play that, have they? And fixed for me to go and play the cliques on the organ in Portsmouth Cathedral.
Ah,
So I got, good opportunity to go and actually do some of this at first hand.
that's an extraordinary experience. Yes, I mean, I had a similar one as a boy when I tried to play a Franck piece with a very gentle flute and celeste, not reading, of course, that he wanted a very specific reed sound. And as soon as I used that reed sound, the piece made some more sense, and even more sense when I went to
Yeah,
play it on a Cavaille in Farnborough Abbey.
yes, quite.
And so the organ in Poitiers is often described as an instrument that every serious organist needs to have played to understand some of the repertoire that is written for the organ.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. I mean, I'm not a serious organist really because I play it, but I enjoyed the sounds and I enjoyed learning how to, and all. My organ builder friend Noel Mander in London used me one spring to do a mini apprenticeship with Flentrop in Amsterdam, and they sent me to play the historic instruments all over the country. Teach me much. Well, they taught me how to voice flue pipes on an inch wind pressure,
Mm.
but they sent me all Holland playing the historic instruments.
Wonderful. So that's a little bit about organ and historic understanding of how repertoire has been played and developed. In a sense, your lifetime has seen a huge change in performance practice, to give it perhaps its correct term. And we're going to hear some singing in a minute from Merton College. So the repertoire you will have experienced as a child is probably beyond all recognition to the repertoire which is sung now at Westminster Abbey.
I should think it is almost entirely different. I mean, there will still be Stanford, but that will be one of the few points of reference, I think. In Oxford, I began to realize that singing could be very different, partly because we had an extraordinarily able and talented Hungarian director of music at the chamber Sarah and I actually met in, called Laszlo Heltai. And he was a refugee from Budapest. He and his mates had taken over the recording studios there and this there when the Russian tanks were rolling in, and he had to get out his teeth and came and eventually was picked up by an admiral who was a clarinet playing bursar of Merton College and got a fellowship there and started these various choirs. And that, of course, was not an English cathedral choir trained organist and choirmaster. That was a very different style of singing he wanted. And that was my other, I think, chief experience of singing, and how very different it could and perhaps should be the fluty, smooth, mellow, Englishy stuff.
So we're going to hear a very impressive recording from Merton, which has had a renaissance of its own in recent times. Tell us what we're going to hear.
Well, we're going to hear a piece by John Shepherd, which is an antiphon, Beata Trinitas, composed by Shepherd, who was organist at Magdalen College, Oxford, sung every evening at the end of the day. And it's a very short little antiphon to the Holy Trinity, asking that the Holy Trinity save and bless and cherish us.
Let's hear it. That's just a beautiful, sublime sound and piece, isn't it? We're going to hear in a minute something from Westminster Cathedral, and we're just harking back to something we said earlier on. So, the sound of the Westminster Cathedral boys was often described as continental to me when I was a music student. Do you know what people mean by that? We seem to have lost your sound again. It seems to be on a. Have you put some more money in the meter, David? I'll answer my own question while we perhaps fiddle with the technology. So when I was a student, the description of the Westminster Cathedral chorister, the boy choristers, was described as continental, and perhaps the recording in a minute will perhaps show you exactly what I mean by that. Bishop David referred to the smooth, perhaps fluty sound of cathedral choristers at Westminster Abbey, but the relatively new choir, because the Westminster Cathedral was only built the beginning of the 20th century, took a lot of its inspiration, obviously, from continental Europe, both musically and in architectural and liturgical sense. And the director of music, George Malcolm, at the time, went for a very perhaps open-throated and more guttural sound, and almost perhaps you might say a natural sound. So while we wait for David to come back on again from his connection, perhaps Joseph, you could play these two short movements from Britain's Missa Brevis, which is written for just upper voices, for boys' voices, and male altos, but boy altos in this case. So people listening in to that might hear a very different sound, perhaps than they're used to hearing maybe in Portsmouth Cathedral and in other places, although lots of cathedrals have moved in that much more natural direction in recent times. And that's a glorious piece, of course, that written specifically for boys' voices. So David, if we move on to your time as Provost of Portsmouth, and of course in those days the title was Provost of Portsmouth. How did you first of all, of course, when you first arrived in Portsmouth, you weren't in that role. What was your initial role when you moved to Portsmouth Cathedral?
When I moved to Portsmouth first, I was a residential canon, and I was of ordinands in the diocese, but I was also the cathedral and in charge of the worship. So that was a useful bridge between the world I had inhabited in a school, in a boys' school, the new world that was to be the cathedral and the diocese, and the cathedral finding its feet in the diocese after a turbulent time, and of course the chance to get to work on the cathedral. I think at risk of the bishop to appoint me as provost because I was in my 30s and I'd burned a few fireworks around, I think, in years when I'd been the precentor. And I'd started quite a lot of music making, and I'd done quite a bit of teaching in the diocese. And discovered that by the Queen Mother, who was primed to look up, she could see very much by that stage, to the wall that was falling apart and say, "Is that daylight I can see through there, Mr. Provost?" And so I was primed to say, "Oh, that's where the wall is falling off." "Well, what are you going to do about it?" she said. And so I said, "Well, I have to decide whether to just repatch the temporary wall or put a kind of conclusion to the building on." "Oh, I hope you'll do that," he said. And so we got on the whole business that has led to the cathedral that you all now see, and was touching because it was the fourth attempt to try and complete the cathedral after the failed both before the war and then after the war, and with enormous and gigantic Festival of Britain schemes as part of what was proposed, and to create a building that would have been completely ideal, not only with what was already existing in Thomas's, but also with the surrounding. So I'm really pleased that they never managed to do it. I don't know about you, but I think it's fine as it now.
Absolutely. No, we daily rejoice in all the work that you achieved in your time here through our delight at using the building in all manner of ways as we do these days. So not many people get an opportunity to finish a cathedral. That's I hate the expression almost unique, but it probably is almost unique. There aren't very many provosts or deans who go into a job and then depart the job having done that exact thing. That must have been a wonderful moment to savor and enjoy.
Yes, it was, but I didn't manage to get to enjoy it very much
Quite.
because afterwards I got moved. And so that was rather early. I mean, one of the first things we did when we had finished the building and opened it was not only to get you historic organ, because I thought I might get breaks for picking up a historic organ that was in danger in the place where it was, as well as being a really and historically very interesting instrument, having been built by Nicholson's for the Great in 1851, and then sort of shelved off by being put into Minster Cathedral for a bit before being put in a kind of inner city church where it had become virtually redundant. But the other thing that we did shortly after Cathedral was to do a performance of the Monteverdi Vespers. And everybody said, "Oh, see why you built the cathedral like it is, because you wanted all those."
We've lost the sound a bit, David, again. So I'm going to move over to my secondary piece of kit, which is a good old iPhone. And let's see if we can pick you up on that.
Well, I can work on that.
So our delightful congregation and community will tell us if they can still hear you.
Yes, well, I'll talk away. And I can hear it echoing down the system.
Hopefully people can hear. Now, you probably will have to tell us exactly where you are in the country, which might explain the lack of tip-top broadband. Where have you retired to? We're jumping the gun a bit, I know, but where have you retired to?
We now live in Stancliffe, which is in Weardale in County Durham. I'm now hearing myself about 3 or 4 times.
Right, we will move over to our next piece of music by the Don't Stop the Carnival, and we won't stop the carnival. We will hear a little bit of music and resolve our echo.
Stop the carnival. No, don't stop the carnival. You'll never find a better way. No, don't stop the carnival. You got to sing the night and day away. This is England on a winter's afternoon. There is no sun, there's just a pale and tired moon. The shivering sparrows on the smoking chimney tops, and all the children suffer from cold and flu and rain.
So I think we've mastered the technology, David. We'll come back to the tail end of Portsmouth and the beginning of Salisbury. Now, tell us a little bit about why we suddenly had a carnival.
Well, that's because I thought we ought to have something before the technology invaded our lives. I was going to have taken you through being a curate after getting married and the Brittonness of brevis, and being a curate in Leeds, where for 2.5 years I worked in a back-to-back housing area in the southwest of Leeds. Funny enough, an enormously public church with a huge German 19th century organ in it, so that's not why I went. But I did very little there of music making, except in the youth club. And that was a record I remember being on top of the pops in the youth club in 1968. And because it had a kind of West Indian carnival feel, we went to a test match in Headingley when our eldest was very small. And Sarah was feeding her, along with a lot of other West Indian women in the back row of Headingley cricket ground. So we were able to do that, feel quite part of the scene in back-to-back Leeds in the 1960s.
Wonderful.
But that was a kind of all-track before we got into the business of being captain to Clifton and then being first to Cannon and then provost to Portsmouth.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, so tell us a little bit about how you heard that you were to be Bishop of Salisbury.
Well, there were two things. One, I didn't quite understand at the time, but there was a question as to who was going to chair the liturgical commission of the Church of England. And rather surprisingly, I got a letter from the Archbishop of York saying, would I take this on? And so I arranged to meet him and said, I wouldn't mind doing it. I've been a member of the commission by that time for about 8 or 9 years. But it must be somebody who's in the House of Bishops, because if we're going to do all the revision of the ASB and make a new worship book or series of books for the Church of England, that'll have to be to and fro with the House of Bishops almost on a weekly basis. And so I said, you must have a bishop. And he said, no, it's quite all right. I think you can do it. And I promise you, you have ready access to the House of Bishops whenever you want. And this was a couple of months before. One day I had a letter which Sarah popped up for me on the kitchen table, leaving me a message saying, I think it's one of those letters. Because the letters from Downing Street always have 10 Downing Street in Gothic letters on the back if you're going to be a dean or a bishop. Or if it's classical letters, it means you're going to be a Lord Lieutenant. So that's why the appointment system used to work in those days. Because, of course, we never put in for anything. Indeed, I wouldn't have dreamt of putting in for anything like that. And I came home from a day in London and split this envelope open and read it very quickly and saw it was indeed a letter. And I saw the word Salisbury, but I was desperate for a P. So I left the letter on the table and went to the loo and thought, that's very odd. I thought the Dean of Salisbury was still, because there had been a number of cathedrals you had been after me. Having built one cathedral, they might go and help them prop up another one. And it never occurred to me that it might be to the bishop, going to the bishop. So I came back and read the letter carefully. And indeed, I assumed it was probably a joke from my colleague, Stephen Platten, the Bishop of Wakefield, as he became, who was then my successor as a canon and DDO in Portsmouth. And he had a way of getting hold of notepaper from all sorts of people, like the embassy in Japan or the cardinal archprefect of the Vatican. And I imagined it was him and ran my finger through the signature of supposedly of John Major, and the ink ran. Then I thought, perhaps it's genuine. And I read it carefully, and it was to go and be the bishop and not the dean. So it was an odd little passage of arms. And it was a pity because we'd only just finished the cathedral, really, and I was looking forward to enjoying it a bit. I mean, I've had in my mind's eye what it might be like for the last previous 10 years, but that's not quite the same as getting used to doing things in it and encouraging the congregation to inhabit it and move through it and all those other things which we were able to do in those days.
Absolutely, and of course, one of the as some of our people joining us tonight will know, there's something very unusual about Church of England bishops, well, in many ways, but particularly in the fact that really you don't have your own cathedral in terms of you do have a cathedral, it's your seat, but you don't have an awful lot to say on a day-to-day or even a week-to-week basis about what goes on in it. So it must have been rather odd to have just built one and then had to move to another cathedral where you didn't have an awful lot of day-to-day say.
Well, it was in a way. The note to his successor to me and said, watch out for that man Stancliffe. He'll try and take over the cathedral probably while there's a vacancy. But I mean, the life of a bishop is much too busy to get involved in running any one particular building. And anyhow, there is a whole range of other things that needs attending to, not only in caring for parishes and for the clergy in the diocese, but on the wider scene with, there was all the liturgical commission stuff, preparing for common worship, and there was the work in the House of Lords, and there were the other things of national and international importance, like getting to the Sudan regularly. I mean, the best thing about the Diocese of Salisbury, really, was that it is linked with the Diocese of the Sudan, which then were only about 24 of them, and are now more than 30, such as the church grown in those days. But that was the real opportunity for the Diocese of Salisbury to take part in the life of the whole church worldwide, and the extraordinary kindness and hospitality and welcome and holiness of the people there, which put a lot of our kind of local parochial shenanigans around in Salisbury into the shade.
We're going to jump to a bit of Monteverdi now, because I know you, as you said a moment ago, people thought you might have designed Portsmouth Cathedral for this particular wonderful piece, but I'm sure also it will have been performed many times in Salisbury Cathedral. So we'll have a little bit of Monteverdi Vespers. So you've given us a snapshot of life in Salisbury, and sorry, it is just a snapshot. But then you always planned to retire up to County Durham?
We hadn't really at all, but I think I did want to be somewhere in range of a cathedral and a university, and the kind of things that go on in those places. And so when I came to the lecture in Durham, we thought, well, that might be a nice place to be, but we really thought we might go to Ripon on the way home. We went to visit it, and it rained, and there wasn't any cultural life visible in Ripon at all. And so we thought, well, what about going to Durham? And my sister, who's been teaching history at the university in Durham most of her working career, said, well, they were looking for a house to retire into, but here was a house that was much too big for them and a bit too far out of Durham. Would be interested. And so, although we were about to go off to a conference of Societas Liturgica in South India to meet with all the world liturgists, we came up quickly and put an offer in for this 1750 house, Georgian house on the banks of the River Wear, looking right up Weardale. And my secretary texted us when we were away in India and said, because I hadn't really told her about it, you seem to have bought a house in Stanhope. What shall I do with it? And so it was quite an adventure, really. But it did mean that we bought a house before we needed to retire, and we were able to put tenants into it to pay off the mortgage. But you get much more house for your money in the north of England than you do in the south. And anyhow, the air is better and brighter. And the walks by the river where we can watch the dippers and the goose sanders are wonderful, as well as up on the moors. And altogether, it's a brighter, more direct kind of life than we would have had to suffer in the south of England.
It's just the internet's rubbish. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's fair enough. So we're going to hear some Bach in a minute. So tell us a little bit about how much music has filled your life during retirement so far.
Well, the lucky thing is that the person who was doing old music in the university in Durham left just as we arrived. And although I didn't get there straight away, the chance for youngsters who come to call scholarships at the cathedral or in the college choirs in Durham, which is where they go if they can't get into King's or New College, was great. And really, I was able to give them the chance of working with period instruments and doing lots of Bach cantatas and things like that. And indeed, before the lockdown supervened, I was taking a group of just 8 singers, one to a part, to do the Monteverdi Vespers in Italy, in a tour in Lombardy, which was the first casualty of the lockdown for me and for them. So it's not been quite what it might have been this last year, but for the previous 10 years, it's been absolutely splendid. And we've had really talented people, a number of whom are now good young professional musicians and surviving.
Wonderful. And so we're going to hear a bit, a part of a Bach cantata. Which track have you chosen?
This is an aria for a tenor with an obbligato violin, and I choose it because this particular recording, because Alice Arnoncourt, who plays the violin, was married to Nicholas Arnoncourt, the conductor, and they produced a world-changing series of Bach cantatas on disc using boys' choirs in the 1970s and 80s. And the first kind of serious old music Bach that there was, and the whole lot of Bach cantatas got done by then. And we listened to them, and we followed them very closely, and we watched how the instruments were developing. But I may say that we have begun to use period instruments by 1975. I think I gave the first performance in England of the B minor Mass on period instruments by a week from Roger Norrington. He rang up all the players who agreed to come and play for me for nothing, and said, "What's he paying you? Because I'll pay you more." And they all said, "No, do it the week after. We had a jolly good rehearsal the week before. We're playing for him. So they did. And those days, if you didn't have Mike Laird to play the trumpet, you couldn't do it. Because he was the only sufficiently expert player on an actual trumpet in England. These days, they turn them out of the music colleges, 10 a penny. But the young are amazing these days, what they can do. But in those days, it was a pretty skillful art. And it remains so. But this is not that. This is a reconstruction of the violin part by Alexander Corr, which is beautiful because it shows something about the scholarship that's needed. Survives the continuo part and the voice part. And she has written a part that takes the voice part and turns it into an elaborate ritornello.
Here it is. Here it is. Well, David, it's been wonderful to hear you talk in this way about your musical experience and how much you've brought not only to your ecclesiastical career, but through music as well. And it still is I would say actually, it's still a battle in certain ways to make sure that music is experienced and performed in I wouldn't say the correct way, but the most appropriate way. I remember when I first came to Portsmouth, I wanted to put on a performance of Handel's Messiah, and was trying to find a band that would manage to do an authentic performance. And whenever I approached some musicians in the locality, all they could come up with was say, "Oh, we'll play it in a baroque kind of way," which isn't really what we want for a performance of Handel's Messiah. And it's been great to have a tradition in the cathedral in the last 10 years or so of doing Messiah at baroque pitch, and the children in the choir have really had an opportunity to experience how the music can come to life when it's done at the right tempi, with the right forces, and at the right pitch. So it's been glorious to hear how you were at the forefront of much of that. Now, one of our community, Ian, who helps out and was vicar of the close in Salisbury before he came here, tells the tale of you always checking that your aforementioned secretary knew what your funeral mass music should be before you set off for the Sudan. So I think you have a particular piece of music you wanted to always make sure was ready to be primed if that should ever have happened on the way back to or back from Africa. What piece was that?
Well, I think when I was talking to Ian, that's as I was thinking of some birds.
Yes.
It's very odd that I've done a whole program without having any birds in this at all. But I think now one of the groups that I think has really got the balance right between how they present their own music and how they do Bach is the amazing group called Vox Luminis, which is Belgium. And they began as instrumentalists before they started singing together, which is perhaps why they sing not like singles, oh, Tommy, like that, but they sing directly and clearly and brightly. And so the piece that I would like at my deathbed, well, I may change my mind tomorrow, who knows, is this marvelous piece sung by Vox Luminis of one of the Bach ancestors.
Wonderful, and we'll fade out with this piece. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, David.
Yes, thank you for having me. Sorry, the techniques are very good from beautiful stuff.
Well, thank you for battling it. We'll leave our listeners with this particular wonderful luminous track.